Taking tack-sharp images is a common struggle for many photographers, but I can show you exactly how to take perfectly sharp images regardless of the shooting situation. Whether it's a fast-moving action shot or a low-light scene, all you need to know is how to set up your camera, and there's 7 things to consider. We're going to cover all of them in this video. The first thing to consider when trying to take a perfectly sharp photo is whether you want to shoot on manual focus or autofocus. Now, this is a consideration that most photographers overlook these days. When I started with photography, I used to play with old film cameras and I had no choice but to manually focus. With modern photography, there's much more availability of the autofocus motor, so it's much less of a consideration. But it is still a very useful tool. Sometimes when you're taking photos of something and you can't get the focus to be just right, you can shift it to manual focus. It's not something to be scared of. Usually it actually works out better when you're in low light situations. So an example of this is if I was shooting at a concert and I know that my camera is going to really struggle to focus of a person moving around on a stage. Instead, I can switch to manual focus and follow them with my eye. It's not as easy, sure, but it does produce better results at times, especially in low light. Another situation will be when you're shooting something with a tripod. If I'm taking a landscape photograph and I've got my camera on a tripod, I'm going to focus maybe a third of the way into the frame, and all I need to do is set the focus to manual, adjust it, and then I can leave it. Now, every time I go to take a photograph, I know that it's going to be set perfectly on the focus, and I'm going to have a tack-sharp image. Another consideration is right here. Let's say I'm shooting at a shallow depth of field and I'm trying to get these leaves, this beautiful color on these leaves. It's this combination of purple and green. And because I'm shooting at a shallow depth of field, the tiniest movement in focus is going to produce a different result. So I could try and move around my focus point, or instead I could just switch it to manual focus and I can play with the focus point until I'm happy. So I'm shooting at f3.5 here, and I can ensure that it is focused exactly where I want it to be without having to fiddle around with a joystick to find the right focus point. So don't overlook manual focus. It's still incredibly important if you want to take back control from your camera to ensure that you get the best results. If you've ever taken a photo of a still object and you've noticed that your camera's focus goes in and out and in and out, and it's struggling to find the focus, well, chances are you were on the wrong focus mode. There are 3 different focus modes in most cameras. They are one shot, or AFS, so one shot on Canon cameras, and most other cameras is AFS, autofocus single. AI servo, which is autofocus continuous, AFC on most other cameras, and then AI focus, which is for a Canon camera, which is AFA, autofocus automatic for most other cameras. So what's the difference? Well, if you're taking a photo of something that's not moving, like this old fountain, then I would want to use one shot mode or autofocus single. What I'm telling my camera is you're going to focus once and then you're going to take the photo. That's all I want you to do. Whereas if you are taking a photo on autofocus continuous or AI servo, you're telling your camera, we're going to shoot in burst fire mode, and in between each shot, the subject we're taking the photo of is going to be moving. And as it moves, I want you to refocus in between each shot. So when you go to take a photo of a fountain like this, your camera thinks it's trying to take a photo of something that's moving, and it's going to struggle to focus. So put your camera into whatever shooting mode you want, and it could be burst fire, it could be single shot, doesn't matter what camera mode, whatever you're using, but make sure that you've got one shot or AFS, autofocus single set. That way I know that when I put up a composition of this fountain, this would look great in black and white. When I go to take a photo, it's only going to focus once. So I'm going to set that now. So each time I took a photo there, when I pressed the shutter release button, it focused, then it took a photo. It focused and it took a photo. It's not trying to focus, and struggling to take the photo. Now I'm going to go over to the cycle path and I'm going to capture a cyclist as they cycle past me. The important thing is I'm going to switch now to autofocus continuous, or AI servo, on this camera, and I'm going to be shooting in a burst fire mode. That way the camera knows that the subject is going to be moving and it needs to continually focus between shots. The third mode, as I mentioned earlier, is AI focus, or autofocus automatic. It's supposed to be an intelligent version, and it's supposed to work out whether that subject's moving or standing still. And to be honest, I don't use it. I know what I'm shooting. I mostly shoot one shot anyway. And I know that I'm gonna have better luck telling my camera exactly what I'm doing than letting the camera work it out for itself. So now we're gonna go and shoot AI servo, autofocus continuous, and you'll see that the camera does refocus in between those images. One of your camera's most important features is the autofocus selection points. This is super useful when it comes to focusing your frame and making sure that everything is in sharp focus, because when you look through the viewfinder, you'll see a number of different points, and you can align these with the parts of the frame that you want to be in focus. You can use all of the autofocus points, you can use just one of them, and sometimes, and in most cases, you can use a few of these selection points at once. When I got my camera, it was automatically selected to look at the whole frame, look at all the focus points, and it will decide for itself where it should focus. And it gets it right maybe 80% of the time. It's not foolproof. The way I do it instead, using one autofocus point, is foolproof. The difference being, when you look at the whole frame, the camera is trying to decide what you'd like to have in focus. And oftentimes it might be something in the background and not the foreground, or something to the edge of the frame and not the center. And the camera, although it does a fairly good job, will oftentimes get it wrong. So instead of looking at the whole frame and looking at the whole scene, essentially, you can move your autofocus selection points to just one single autofocus point. So I'm going to look at the whole frame now. I'm going to take a photo. What I want is this rose, and I want this flower, this bud that's coming into bloom, and let me put it in focus. And as I suspected, it's actually focusing on the wrong part of the frame. However, if I go ahead and I change my autofocus point to just one, I can now use my joystick or whatever feature is on your camera. You can move this around and you can highlight the area of the scene that you'd like in focus, and instead of looking at the whole scene, you tell your camera, that right there is where I want to focus. I'm going to tell my camera, autofocus point goes there. And I know 100% without a shadow of a doubt that that scene is exactly the way I want it to be focused. That's why it's important to take back control from your camera, and if you can, just use one autofocus selection point. If you really want to take sharp photos, you have to master your shooting modes. And there's 4 main shooting modes on your camera. There's program mode, aperture priority, shutter speed priority, and manual mode. Now, program mode is basically an extension of full auto mode. It allows your camera to do too much, and it's not a good choice when you're trying to take sharp photos because it might prioritize the wrong thing. With sharp photos, a lot of the time what we need is a fast shutter speed. So program mode isn't reliable enough, so we don't use that. Secondly, we have aperture priority mode. Aperture priority mode is pretty good. I mean, if you're taking a landscape, you don't need to worry about the shutter speed because your camera's on a tripod. And aperture priority mode is a good mode to use because you can set a nice narrow aperture and get a deep depth of field without having to worry about motion blur or camera shake from your camera moving around in your hand. It's a good mode, but for the majority of the time, when you're trying to take sharp photos, and if you don't want to use manual mode, because obviously manual mode is the best mode you could possibly use at all times, which I say a little bit tongue-in-cheek because we'll come to that. It's good, but it's not ideal for every situation. For sharp photos, the one thing that you cannot fix in post-production yet, I have seen some software where this may be fixed in a few years, you can't fix a blurry photo. So if you take a photograph and your shutter speed isn't fast enough and whatever you're trying to capture is moving, say a bird in flight, and you just can't quite get it sharp, you know, the face is moving a little bit. If the shutter speed is not fast enough, then that image is not going to come out sharp. There's going to be motion blur and there's nothing you can do to fix that. So if you really want sharp photos, the majority of the time you need to be thinking shutter speed first, which is why you use shutter speed priority mode. Shutter speed priority mode will allow you to prioritize the motion blur, ensuring there's no motion in your image. If you prioritize your shutter speed, you're saying, I want the photo taken like that. I don't want any motion because I'm going to set my shutter speed to 1,000th of a second or whatever it needs to be. And also we have manual mode. Obviously you can do all of this that you would do in shutter speed priority in manual mode, and you can also adjust the aperture at the same time. So you can have the best of both here. You can have a fast shutter speed and you can have a narrow aperture for a deep depth of field. But you have to consider, okay, do I have enough light? Do I need to increase the camera's sensor sensitivity by increasing the ISO? You can do all of that in manual mode, but oftentimes manual mode can be a little bit redundant. When you're shooting in predictable situations like fast-moving subjects, where you know that the aperture may not be a priority at all and you don't need to think about it and you're happy for the camera to set it, then you can ignore manual mode and you can focus instead just on shutter speed priority mode. Shutter speed is undoubtedly one of the most important factors to taking a sharp photo. If you get motion blur in your image, you can't fix that in post. And I want to share a simple rule for capturing sharp photos. So if you're shooting handheld and whatever you're taking a photo of is not moving, then there is a simple rule for deciding on the shutter speed that you can use. So what is the absolute slowest shutter speed you can use? Well, I'm going to use my 24-70 camera here, and I'm going to set it to 24mm. As a rule, I can use this camera at 1/24th of a second. Any slower than that, and I'm going to capture some motion blur. And if I set it to 50mm, I could use it at 1/50th of a second shooting handheld, and any slower than that, I would get motion blur. Because the further you zoom in, the more noticeable the motion blur is from camera shake. It's a very simple rule and it's easy to follow. If you have a look at your focal length and you set that to your shutter speed, then you really can't go too wrong. Now, there is one thing you need to know about this, and that this is a rule for full frame cameras. The majority of people don't use full frame cameras. They tend to use crop sensor cameras, and crop sensor cameras have a smaller sensor. And because of that, they have a magnifying effect on the photo. So if you're using a crop sensor camera, then you actually want to multiply the focal length by 1.5. So if I'm shooting at 50mm, I don't want a shutter speed of any slower than 1/75th of a second, or 1/80th of a second, somewhere around there. You need to remember this needs to be multiplied by 1.5. So full frame camera, you can just go 50mm, 1/50th of a second. If you have a crop sensor camera, you need to take that 50mm and multiply it by 1.5. And I'll show you that now. I'm going to take a photo of these trees behind me at 24mm. I'm going to set my shutter speed to 1/25th of a second. Now, it's a very slow shutter speed. The slightest bit of movement, I'm going to get some motion blur, which is why it's the absolute maximum, slowest shutter speed that you can use. So I'm going to turn around now, I'm going to take a photograph. These trees aren't going anywhere fast. And I'm going to zoom in on my camera so I can just check the focus and the motion blur, and I can see, okay, everything here is sharp. But when I took that photograph, you probably heard yourself, you can actually hear the movement of the shutter because it's pretty slow. So now I'm going to change the shutter speed. I'm going to put it to 1/15th of a second now. And if I zoom in, yeah, I can see motion blur in this image now. This motion blur has come from my camera shake of when I went to press this button down. It's really hard to not move it at all, you know? You usually have a tiny bit of movement as you press that button. So that's taking photos of a still life scene. What do we do when we take photos of something that's moving? For example, a bird in flight. If you want to capture a bird in flight, well, first of all, you have to consider your focal length. If you're zooming in, you need a faster shutter speed because you don't want the motion blur from your hands. And you also need to consider that they move really quickly. You know, the birds are going to flap like this, and you want to get that really sharp. And because of that, you need to crank up the shutter speed. We're talking 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second. You need to keep pressing it higher and higher until you're happy. It's okay to have a little bit of motion blur, but the key features of the bird should be in focus. The bird's wings can have a little bit of motion in them that actually adds to the image, I'd say. But for the majority of photographs, you want to have the core body to be tack sharp and in focus. And to do that, you need to increase your shutter speed. Nice and simple, turn your shutter speed up. You don't need to think about your aperture or your ISO because you really don't have a choice. You have to set a fast shutter speed, and the aperture is a second priority and the ISO is probably the third priority. Don't worry about them. Make sure your shutter speed is nice and fast to capture that motion blur. So now I'm going to go and take some photos of some birds and you'll see exactly what I mean. So I'm zoomed in to 70mm here. I've got my shutter speed to 1/80th of a second, perfectly fine for still life scenes. But these birds are about to move and I'm going to take a photo at 1/80th of a second and just watch the motion blur we're going to get. And also I'm going to be moving my camera. This isn't handheld still, it's going to be moving. You'll see there's going to be much more motion. So the photos actually come out looking pretty cool, but there's definite motion blur. It's a cool photograph, but it is by no means sharp. If you want to get sharp images of a moving object, you need a faster shutter speed. So we'll do that now. I'm going to turn my shutter speed all the way up to 1/1000th of a second for this. I'm going to go to some birds over here. So that came out pretty good. It's still a little bit soft. I'm going to increase the shutter speed a little bit further and we'll find some more birds and take another shot. When you're trying to take a perfectly sharp photo, it's not enough to simply have a fast shutter speed and good focus. You also need to consider the depth of field, and that is determined by your aperture. If you have a narrow aperture, you have a deep depth of field. The majority of the photo is going to be in focus. If you have a wide aperture, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field, and even more, if you have a wide aperture and the subject you're focusing on is very close to your camera, it's going to be even shallower still. So you need to consider the aperture that you set if you want a deep focus and therefore a very sharp image. So let me show you that now. I'm going to set my camera here to f2.8 and I'm going to take a photo of some of these daisies. If I focus on a daisy that's right in front of me here, we can see that the photo comes out very soft. Everything else behind it is going to be out of focus. However, if I focus at the same aperture, f2.8, and I focus further into the distance, a lot more of the scene is going to be in focus. If I change the aperture, this time let's set it to f8, and I focus right in front of me again, I can see that a lot more of that scene is in focus. So that just goes to show the importance of setting the right aperture. If you want deep focus throughout your whole scene, you can't have a really wide aperture with a shallow depth of field. You need to consider that maybe you want a narrow aperture for deeper focus. Back button focus is a feature on your camera that you may not know about. It's absolutely brilliant for focusing and taking fast photos and ensuring that your photos all come out sharp. And it is exactly what it says on the tin. It is a button on the back of your camera that will allow you to focus. So instead of relying on the shutter release button, which is going to focus, do the metering and then take the photo, you allow the back button, in this case on a Canon camera it's AF on, you can look at your own camera manual for this. It will allow the back button to focus, and then all the shutter release button does is take the photograph. And that means it's a lot faster. So let me show you the difference. If I take some photographs now, just random scenes around me, and I'm not going to use back button focus, you can see there's a slight delay as the camera tries to focus. If I lock the focus by using AF on, the back button, let's focus over there, and now when I take a photograph, it's absolutely instant. The camera is focused and you don't need to worry about focusing again between shots. It allows you to be much faster on the trigger, which is always useful. It's very good for when you know whatever you're taking a photograph of is not going to move. So a landscape, for example, nature photography, anything where there typically is not going to be much movement. So I'm going to take a photograph here. We've got the river and some buildings in the background, some trees and everything. I'm going to use back button focus, so I'll set the focus to where I want it to, and then I can play around with compositions. You can focus and recompose because you know that the focus is not going to move. And that's back button focusing. It allows you to be much quicker when you go to take a photograph because the focus is done. You don't need to worry about that. You can recompose as you like, and then when you press the shutter release button, the photo is taken. Hey, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video and like to see more like it, then please consider subscribing too. We're releasing new video content every Monday at 12 p.m. London time every week of the year, so you'll see much more video content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.